And welcome to the Bring the Heat podcast. I'm your host, X Brad, and this week we've got Jason with us and our very special guest, Matthew Hipple of the Center for International Maritime Security. Matt, how about giving us a brief bio and a plug for SimSec?
All right, I am a naval officer, and the Venn diagram of official positions of the United States government and the United States Navy and my personal opinions do not intersect, and I'm also the president of the Center for International Maritime Security, and I host its Sea Control podcast, as well as our upcoming podcast called Real-Time Strategy, which is going to be a discussion on sort of video games, and the lessons on and board games as well, and the lessons on strategy that you can learn from them, and the ones that you should also not learn from them. So it'll be kind of a fun experiment to see all the different stuff we talk about. But SimSec's a really exciting project. I'm really proud to be part of it. It's about almost 3 years going now, and it's a mixture of online content, which is kind of core of what we do. It's maritime security, history, politics, technology, that kind of stuff. We try to put out a broad brush that can integrate a lot of different people and a lot of different interests that are ultimately all connected. You know, they all sound like different categories, but they all touch on one another. But it's also a lot of group meetings. We have a great group out in the United Kingdom, a group in D.C., and we're trying to build our Hampton Roads group down here in Norfolk. Unfortunately, everybody knows that anyone who's down here in Norfolk is busy working their ass off, so they don't have the luxury of going out as much as all those bastards in D.C. where all their frickin' fancy parties and fun pub talks get to do. But, we try. But it's a really fun group. It's great. It's been a pleasure. I just got elected president for the past 2 years. I've been director of the blog. We churched it up a little bit and made it director of online content, so it's cooler. But holy crap, you do all the editing and the posting and the scheduling. After 2 years, that starts to get a little old, and then my wife has got a baby on the way, and then you realize I'm going to need something a little bit more in the at the 10,000 foot level here, or this is all trying to manage all this stuff is going to drive me crazy. So, I recommend everybody to go to our website, www.cimsec.org. We're going to be posting a number of our compendiums of some of our old topic weeks, and of course, take a look at our submission section and some of our call to articles, and consider sending us something, because more content makes the editors' jobs easier.
Yeah, and I should stress that it's not strictly a Navy blog. It's anything to do with maritime security or international security that has a maritime tangent to it. Piracy, shipping,
harbor security, migration. I even have sought out people on topics that have nothing to do with maritime issues, and I'm like, look, just throw 2 sentences in there. Give me something. Throw it in there because I want you to post this article at SimSec because I like it so much. So we're not picky. We're in it because we like the game. It's fun. It's really interesting, and the field in general is a fascinating one. So we're not too up our own butts about it, if you know what I mean.
Sure. I mean, this is not a high-level think tank that's not accessible to the layman. I mean, there's quality content, but it's not a white paper that nobody's ever going to read. And that's one of the things I like about it.
Nobody's paid. None of us are paid. This is all voluntary work, from the writers to the president to the board of directors. I'd say, arguably, if you're one of the officers or one of the board members, sometimes being a member does put you into the red a little bit. I got this stupid Zoom recorder on my desk here that I use for podcasts that put me back about $200, but it is. It's kind of low-level, understandable stuff. We're not going to be putting out white papers anytime soon. Everything's free, and sort of by design, that means that you're going to get content that is simple, kind of back-of-the-napkin ideas. A lot of in-depth stuff, too. Folks do kind of put some of their heart and soul into some of these topics, but they do so in a way that makes them accessible. And really, that's kind of the part that really makes us proud is when articles kind of get out there and get some popularity and can, guys from the Army, guys from the Air Force, guys from the Navy, civilian policy types read it, and they all understand it. It's written in a language that they all understand. So, we try our best.
Yeah, and speaking of getting stuff out there in the language that we understand, let's take a minute and get on topic about China, their maritime strategy, and our Pacific pivot. Right now, to the listeners, if you've been following the news at all, the Chinese Navy 20 years ago was a joke. It was we laughed at it literally. And in the intervening 2 decades, they have built a very impressive blue water fleet with surface combatants from an aircraft carrier that even they admit is just a training platform. They've got bigger and better planned. And their destroyers and their frigates and their corvettes are just about as good as anybody in the world. And in terms of technology, maybe half a generation behind our top-of-the-line stuff. So they're a real valid fleet, and they continue to expand. And with that, we've also seen their increased, I don't want to say bellicosity, but assertiveness in the waters off of China. For instance, the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And you've probably heard that they're building islands in the waters offshore, dredging up and actually just building an island that can be used as an air base or as a port facility. And Matthew, I'd kind of like to hear what you think their strategy is in the long term, and how do we counter that?
Well, I think it's important to put some things in historical context. For example, before the Russo-Japanese War, when the Tsarists got their asses handed to them by the Imperial Japanese Navy, that was about 50 years of development from the time when Commodore Perry first showed up in Japan. And that is in a world much different than the one we have today. There's a lot of advantages we have with the ability to sort of gain access to technology. So the Hyundaization is, I forget the author, and it kills me because I love that article to death in the Wall Street Journal, but describing sort of the proliferation of the defense industry in general. And Japan was initially sort of an unwilling recipient, and going from a much lower level to become sort of a first-rate naval power. And that's in 50 years, and we're talking today about China, which has almost unlimited access to Russian arms, has massive industry on a scale that Imperial Japan can only imagine. And people are like, oh, don't worry about it, it's still a long way off. No, it is not. For years running, China is the #1 producer of warships and fighter aircraft. I mean, you name it, they've got it. And what a lot of people don't appreciate is when they make that budgetary comparison. So you take a look and you say, well, they're not spending as much as we are, so maybe it's not as high quality. Well, okay, whatever. Quantity has a quality all of its own, and it's also important to remember that the price basket, so some things I remembered from economics back in college, is that the price basket that the Chinese are playing with is slightly different than the one we use here in the United States. And, of course, they have a lot of state controls on industry to manage prices and force certain kinds of work that we do not have here in our free market economy. And good for us, because we shouldn't have those kinds of controls, because then they would come with all sorts of other horrible things. But I think it's relatively clear. We discuss a lot sort of what's China's strategy. We know exactly what it is. It's very simple. And not to stump my own stuff here, but if you take a look at the article I wrote in War on the Rocks, which I believe was entitled Leapfrogging U.S. Deterrence in the Pacific, The Chinese know the red lines of Japan. They know the red lines of the United States. They know what's being risked, what's on the table, and so they just play behind that line. There's a lot you can do in a realm that's not conflict, that's using your defense industrial might. What's Vietnam going to do? What's Japan going to do? What are the Philippines? What's Indonesia really going to do when a navy that can field over 270 ships in the region comes out and says, you know what, I'm going to build an island here today? You'd be insane. You can't go out and do battle with their navy over that. It makes no sense to you. The payoff is, for those individual little instances, is never enough. But when you combine all those individual instances of what they're doing, they're building a norm, an international norm. They're establishing. We all know that ownership is 9/10. It's 9/10 of the law. And that's really what they're playing to. And they don't have to play to any other standards. They don't have to have some sort of complicated, in-depth strategy. They just need to establish a norm. They need to make a nuisance of themselves, so they go smashing fishing vessels and establishing air defense identification zones. And there's a certain point where people, out of exhaustion, will just, sort of the day-to-day folks, will acknowledge and accept these things out of convenience. Fishermen are not looking. I mean, some nationalists will, sure, but fishermen aren't looking to do battle for their state. They want to go out, fish, come back home, and feed their families. So where maybe we'll fly a P-8 through the air defense identification zone. A commercial carrier is not going to necessarily do that. They're looking out for the safety of their passengers, and if they don't know what the Chinese are going to do, or the Chinese start rattling the saber, they will start acknowledging and complying with the standards that are implied, and all of these things are done under an escalatory sort of line that hasn't been activated yet. I mean, most of the folks involved in these conflicts, save for Vietnam, the ones with a lot of these territorial disputes, are kind of democracies of varying natures. They're not going to just get up, and they can't do what the Chinese do militarily and politically, and they can't assume that they can incur certain political costs, and they certainly don't have much of the capability necessary to push back. So the Chinese really, they're just going to push. They're not going to throw a punch. They're not going to shoot anybody. They're just going to push the tiny guys who are disorganized and shove them away. And it's not a very complicated strategy. And there's so much discussion about it often, and I feel that because there's a lot of subtlety there, and you don't know where they're going to go next. But to a certain point, it is really kind of open and shut. It's obvious. It's when you want a thing and somebody grabs it and they just pull it out of your hands.
Well, and I think the question is about the end game. Is China looking to be an expansionist nation, which, with the exception of this type of activity, they really haven't been. And their diplomacy always says that they're for non-interference with the sovereignty of others. Or are they attempting to establish a defensive barrier, strategic depth, if you will, through the first line defense, the chain of islands defense, which, by the way, look how well that worked for Japan. And it should be noted, though.
Japan was a very different circumstance. I mean,
sure.
The amount of natural resources and people that China has access to today. I mean, I think they are, if not are close to, a third of the world's population. Well, no, that's too much. What's our world population at? 6 billion now?
No, we're about 7.5 billion. So they're about
7.5 billion.
So about 1 in 5 is Chinese.
Yeah, that's 20% of the world's population. Imperial Japan couldn't boast anything like that.
Yeah.
That's insane. And they're a landlocked country with plenty of natural resources. You can't isolate China. It's touching Europe. It's touching. Depending on what you define, Europe as, whatever. But it can reach out and touch Europe. It has access to energy supplies. You know, nothing perfect, but you're not going to do you're not going to do to China what we did to Japan.
Well,
do you think that do you think this is essentially, everybody, most of the maritime powers throughout history post Mahan had read Mahan, had read the influence of sea power on history, and we know that the PLA Navy is reading that. Do you think that this is, an expression of Mahanian doctrine in a Chinese kind of way?
I think it's different because you make a very good point. I mean, I think it goes without saying that the naval establishment in China has read Mahan. I don't think how you avoid reading Mahan if you are a Navy from a regional to a global scale. You have to. It's especially if China plans to contend with the United States. They know it's one of our founding naval documents. And I say founding, I realize that it sort of came a little late, but there were a few years. There's 100 so years before it, but it's still today for what we do a founding document. So what they're doing in the South China Sea, I don't know if that counts as Mahanian because they're not. Are they? Would you really consider them coaling stations? To me, they seem more like logistical fobs, more for kind of air power and projection kind of stuff. It seems to me like maybe more of an air power thing, or an A2AD thing where they can send up anti-air batteries, that kind of stuff. They could go back to Hainan. It's kind of their backyard. You don't need a coaling station in your backyard. It's like saying, does the United States need a coaling station in Cuba if it has a naval base in Miami? Does that really count? Or that's probably more kind of you building a defensive zone and trying to build some defense in depth. I mean, when you get into kind of the Mahanian stuff, I know there's this sort of combination of ports and roads they're trying to build all the way out into Africa. And when you say, are they an expansionist power, perhaps what we need to look at is more kind of some of the theories that say, for example, Britain was the accidental empire. It had lots of strategic interests abroad. It went to defend those interests. And boom, now you have an empire, and you said, "Whoa, wait, was this my plan all along? Well, where did the chicken and the egg process start here?" And as China sort of branches out and it starts to bristle against India, which is always considered the Indian Ocean to be its backyard. I mean, when China starts to combat India on the issue of the Indian Ocean, named after it, being its backyard, they're like, well, what are you doing there? You have the South China Sea, essentially. You're in the Pacific. You don't touch any part of that. You kind of see some of that expansionist tendency in the Chinese. And I know lots of folks say, well, that's not kind of their nature, but people's natures change, and if you have certain goals, it's mission creep. And sometimes mission creep isn't optional. You have to. If you want to defend, this road, you have to take and put some sort of defense in a town. If you want to defend this town, you have to make sure it has power, which involves defending the power station, which involves defending the fuel lines, and on and on and on and on. And how far does the rabbit hole go? Because you can see with some of what China's engagement with its neighbors in Africa, sometimes that whole we don't bother with the internal affairs of other nations, you can kind of see that facade start to crack every once in a while when it's convenient for China. So, the pragmatism of the past, where they had this sort of ideal that served them sort of politically and diplomatically, they're kind of throwing that away. And people look at that and say, well, was that really a core principle, or was that a tool? And I think that in that particular case, it's more of a tool.
Yeah, and I just want to. I just want to say for our listeners, China just recently announced they're building their first overseas naval base, and it's
Right.
going to be in Djibouti on the eastern coast of Africa, which is interesting because our major base there. So it's going to be a case of strange neighbors.
Maybe they'll sort of we'll become roommates. We can use the same base. No, God, no.
Yeah, there's actually a fairly extensive U.S. installation called Camp. I can't even pronounce it. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, and
Yeah, something like that.
Lemon Meringue, and there are several thousand people there. It's a major installation. It's 5 or 6 thousand people. Jason, you were going to
Best
say?
taxi cab drivers on the planet. I've never, before I went to Djibouti, I'd never been in a taxi cab with somebody on drugs. But holy crap. He turns around, he smiles, and you see the green in his teeth, and you're like, this guy's been chewing cotton all day. He's kind of freaking out a little bit. And roads are optional. You know, when Doc Brown comes back and says, where we're going, we don't need roads, I think it was actually talking about Djibouti. Roads are optional.
All right, Jason, you had a point you wanted to ask?
Yeah, kind of getting a little bit more granular. You know, there's been a ton of work out there looking at surface combatants themselves without really looking at some of the logistics ships. There was an interesting article in Real Clear Defense a couple days ago talking about how the PLA is going to expand to about, seven. I'm not even going to get into the Chinese pronunciation of these vessels. There's just no way, and I'm not going to try. But it's kind of interesting. You know, they mentioned in the article you can look at what China wants to do in a maritime context by not looking at the surface combatants or the combat ships, but you know what their level of investment is in the on the underway replenishment side.
What we would call the fleet trains. Yeah. You can't be a power projection force without that.
No, and that was one of the big takeaways I think they had from the anti-piracy deployment in 2008. I went through that. I think it was a Rand article where the PLA just kind of did lessons learned in terms, and a lot of the things that they learned were logistics, not necessarily. It's just the little things about keeping sailors comfortable in the long term and that kind of thing. And obviously, underway replenishment and that kind of thing has a big role to play in the long-term logistics.
Oh yeah. Oh, hey, Matthew, did you see that recruiting video from the PLA and that has been going around?
I did. It's a little kitschy, but it's very good. It reminds me a little bit. I mean, it's a lot like some art stuff. Hey, to get to them, you gotta get through us, and it shows. Oh, look, it's parks and happy, nice cities, and then the Chinese Navy's flying around kicking people in the shit. So it's a pretty motivating video if you're a goose-stepping communist technocrat. Not as comforting if you're going to be on the other side of that equation. But hey, they're getting PR. It's surprising they're getting PR that right, considering the fact that they have a somewhat captive audience. But it's kind of the even in China, it's still media saturated, even though they don't have fun things like Google.
Yeah, what was the ratio of like men and women in China? So I guess all that male energy or whatever you want to call it has to go somewhere.
That's true, and that's some of the things that for all the scare and we recently some of the stats had the Chinese economy surpassing the United States, and you worry about that for a few minutes. Like me, I see that and I go, holy crap, the end is here. Oh God. And then you realize how much of that is based on just magic. Just
it's a command-directed economy. There's no way that growth is over 10%, and they're feeling the consequences of that now.
Exactly. I mean, the abandoned cities alone. I mean, that to me is just starting to get confusing. Like, okay, we get it. You got empty cities, and they didn't go, oh, okay, shakes up. They just keep building them. Where are you going to get all these people from? Like, what are you doing? But it's a great way to make it look like your economy is still chugging along, I guess, to build entire cities on the fly.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. Uh, they're suffering from one of the great risks of a communist nation in that you're okay having a lot of peasants, you're okay having a thin aristocracy. They're building middle class, and that's where political instability comes from. Is if the middle class isn't happy. That'll be interesting. I did want to make a point, though. We were talking about China building the barrier islands and expanding into Djibouti. Uh, they have valid maritime security concerns. There's a stupendous amount of trade that moves out of China, and we always think of it as going into Walmart and picking up all the cheap Chinese-made crap. Well, don't forget they're moving an awful lot of trade through the Straits of Malacca, up the coast of Africa, through the Red Sea, and over to Europe. And they're also taking a lot of trade back the other way. So they do have legitimate maritime security concerns, just like we do. But the question is, are they going to just secure those routes, or, like you said, will they kind of stumble into having to become ever more involved? So, that is kind of a big question going forward.
And there is a lot of it too, where all these places that they're picking out, where they're getting competitive with Japan, and they're starting to mess in the South China Sea. They also seem to surround this one island in particular. I don't know if it's significant or anything, but it kind of sits off the coast of China, and they both claim to be China. And you wonder if, that's part of that long game too. It's probably not the primary driver, but it's a nice sort of extra benefit, because if you kind of hold a lot of logistics, force projecting kind of stuff in the South China Sea, and you're messing with Japan to the north, you have a lot of ability, if you're pre-deployed there already, to really mess around with anybody who tries to interfere with any kind of hybrid or conventional attempt to take Taiwan back. Now, I don't even know if that's what they're going to end up doing, if they're going to kind of keep pressing the soft power methodology of making it almost inevitable, where it becomes a non-issue. People, because it seems like they're just trying to buy the Taiwanese, which I guess, dollar diplomacy is a real thing.
It seems to have been working lately.
Yeah, but there's a certain point, though, I don't think they're going to get bought. I think the Chinese are going to realize that eventually, where the Taiwanese are going to go, yes, thank you for this money, and we very much want to engage in your economy. No, we are not going to let you select our government. I mean, there's no point in which they like doing that, it seems. They enjoy the process of choosing their leadership, so I don't know where China... I mean, who knows? Maybe they have some... I don't know. I'm not a Chinese policymaker, and I'm sure they have as much hopeful thinking in their policy as we have in ours.
Yeah.
I know we talk about, that may not be rational to go for Taiwan, but I think one of the things that we're missing, and, recognize that none of us are Chinese experts, but some of the things internally that are going on with China, especially with the currency devaluation, and then some of just the general corruption. Who's to say that, China, in a fit of to distract the domestic population, may not lash out internationally to just kind of rally everybody behind the flag to make them forget their internal problems.
Right. I mean, that wag the dog's always a possibility.
Let's certainly hope it doesn't come to that. Let's talk about, give me a minute here to segue into the next segment. And it actually does involve Taiwan here, tangentially. Taiwan was kind of, in a large part, some of the inspiration for the massive buildup of the Chinese fleet. Because the last time, in the early 90s, when China was doing some saber rattling against Taiwan, the U.S. steamed a couple of nuclear carrier groups through the area, and there wasn't a thing the Chinese could do about it. And that kind of spurred the Chinese interest into what we call A2AD, anti-access area denial, which is the current Chinese approach to keeping the U.S. Navy away from Chinese coast, and if there were a shooting war. Uh, and one of the current concepts the U.S. Navy is looking at to counter A2AD is kind of centered on the surface. The surface warfare communities buying into a concept of operations they call it distributed lethality. Everybody's a shooter. And before I get you going on that, Matthew, let me explain to the reader. Yes, the Navy has a lot of destroyers and used to have a lot of frigates and all this, that, and the other. But what it has not done since the end of World War II is consider the surface warship as a viable platform for sinking other surface warships. Destroyers were there to provide close-in defense to carrier battle groups. The primary anti-ship weapon in the Navy has been, since 1943, the carrier battle group and its airplanes. And, of course, the sub-community does their thing, too. But we're running out of carrier groups.
The answer to that is going to be submarine. Submarine is primary. Don't tell them I said that, though.
I think you're going to do well using the submarine as the primary anti-ship weapon against destroyers, logistic ships, things like that. The problem is the Chinese have got a metric buttload of corvettes and smaller attack craft. You're not going to do well trying to plink those with a Virginia class or LA class boat. You're going to have to sink them with ships because you're not always going to have enough airplanes around, and that's where we get distributed lethality from. So why don't you give us a thumbnail sketch on the thought behind that?
So the idea for distributed lethality, and it's not a closed book yet, of course. This is a concept that's still being developed. People are still talking about it. We had a week on distributed lethality and the different ways that it could be executed. Everything from a change in the command and control of a force, I'm going to call it a force generically because you don't know what this new kind of construct would be, all the way to putting a crap ton of anti-ship missiles on some kind of hovercraft coming out of an amphibious assault ship. So there's a lot sort of that's still open book. People are still writing these chapters. We haven't decided what the story is yet, but it's taking that force, and instead of centering it around a carrier or making it based on the carrier's offensive, is pushing those ships and little groups forward, kind of taking that sort of decentralized method of operations and making it harder for the enemy to find us. And when you do that and you increase the lethality of your ships, you change the equation, because if it's just a carrier strike group that's driving towards the enemy and is basing its entire ability to kill enemy ships on the sortie rate and weapons available on a carrier, then you're going to have significant problems, because that's one guy going to bad. When you could have, a destroyer, an LCS, or a Zumwalt that's got some sort of weapon system, and they're firing, and they're using some sort of over-the-horizon asset that they're communicating to, and trying to mix it up a little bit. The aircraft aren't going to be able to come out and get us. And if we really want to plink away at the enemy and cause some sort of attrition, or if we want to retain the element of surprise or stealth, you can't just throw everything. You can't throw all your eggs into one basket. So this gives you a lot of flexibility that conventional ideas of let's see where we're going to put our carrier are not going to help you. And especially when it comes to putting the naval strike missile onto extra ships and stuff like that. I mean, it's just it should go without saying. I mean, a surface ship needs to have a massive ability to destroy enemy surface ships, because if you have a carrier taken out, you can't just rely on, okay, I've got maybe 8 harpoon tubes, maybe if I'm that guy with the harpoon tubes, but I'm probably just sitting out here with a Tomahawk that's designed for land strike, and now I'm using SM2s, maybe SM3s against ships. That's just kind of, I'm not doing anything. I have no specialized ability to knock out the enemy, and he's just pumping out Russian anti-ship missiles at me like they're cheap pieces of hard candy from Grandma's house. And it's just a bad day, and nobody likes that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I guess I'm rambling at this point. It is a simple concept. It's a beautiful and simple concept. It just depends on if we get the programs online that enable that kind of action.
Well, go ahead, Jason.
So, you mentioned distributed lethality, and, I don't remember what Sea Control podcast episode it was, but you had a commander of the Surface Warfare Center, like the undergraduate Top Gun analog, if you will. But I really do like the fact that, at least, from an outsider's view's mind, it seems like there seems to be like a renaissance, if you will, going on in terms of being offensive-minded in the surface warfare community. And one of the questions I had was, are there key weapons systems in the surface warfare community that you see in your personal view would kind of reflect that renaissance? I mean, maybe micro UAVs or rail guns or that kind of thing.
Well, I like Scan Eagle, so I like the sort of organic ability to launch small, lightweight, organic ISR. To me, that's awesome. I mean, you put an SH-60 up, it's kind of obvious, kind of big. Folks are going to notice it. You throw some of these small little drones out there, it gives you a certain amount of over-the-horizon targeting capability that maybe you didn't have before. And, of course, when it comes to really having a surface warfare renaissance, I mean, the weapon system has to be the naval strike, the NSM, because that's the weapon. That's the weapon that we're advertising. It's a little slower, but it has a lot of interesting capabilities, and it's what we got.
So you're talking about the Norwegian-made NSM,
yeah.
Kongsberg. Yeah. The Navy is, again, for the listener, the Navy's anti-ship missile for the last almost 40 years has been the Harpoon, and good missile, short range. Getting pretty obsolete. And even worse, we've taken it off most of our surface ships. I think the only thing it's actually mounted on now is the first flight of Arleigh Burke destroyers. So the Navy's looking at buying the NSM, and they're also looking at the LRASM and being able to shoot those out of the vertical launch system. So we want to get to where not only has a doctrine of surface ships not being offensive platforms gone away, we've actually kind of shedded all the weapons that we would use. So yeah, that's a key thing that we are going to have to see. And if I was the head surface warfare officer, I would be pounding on the desk, begging for the NSM, and not worried about rail guns or anything yet until I had that on everything with gray paint.
Well, I am actually a big fan of stuff like the lasers and the railguns, just because I did a lot as an ordnance officer, so it is really a nice idea to me to be like, ooh, I can just carry a bunch of ordnance that doesn't explode. It's really easy to store. And or hey, I don't even have any ordnance. It's just fuel, and I turn it into pure laser. There's a lot of things that people don't necessarily appreciate. Where fuel is fun. If fuel becomes really fungible, it's like, do I want to use this fuel for a laser? Do I want to use it for the railgun? Now, the railgun, of course, will have ordnance with it. But there's a lot where I have more liquid assets, not to make a pun, whereas instead, like, let's say I don't have to use the laser, and I'm just going to go really far. Hey, I've got all that extra fuel. If something comes up, I'm going to use that energy for something else, as opposed to having weight and space that is dedicated to something very specific. Like, hey, I've got so many tons on this ship that is going to be dedicated to, CWIS rounds. Whereas I can say, all right, that's all fuel now.
Okay.
Or
yeah.
whatever the case is.
And you grew up in a very weight constrained platform, so I can see where that influence comes on you.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. It's frustrating because you're like, ooh, I have a cool thing. Can we have this cabinet? And they're like, no. Like, you don't have the weight for that. Because you tell them, like, I have the space. I can put it right here, and it'd be really easy to store things. Like, nah, we're cutting down. We're going to put on this other thing. And you're like, oh, man. It was a very, being on a PC was a very eye-opening experience to me, sort of on a very rudimentary level on sort of naval engineering, where I gained an appreciation for all the sort of good idea fairies flying around that I had, and some very, very cold realities that I had to deal with when it came to just sort of weight and space, magazine depth, that kind of stuff. You can have the coolest guns on the planet, but if you do not have the space for the ordnance, then what are you going to do? Okay, carry 5 rounds for one gun. That's useless. And that does kind of help you appreciate as well this A2AD challenge, because depending on the nature of the weapon system that you're using to defend yourself, you may have the best weapon for individual engagements, but when it comes to an operational level engagement with an A2AD threat, okay, you kill the first 20 missiles 100%, no problem. Great. Here comes another 30. Oh wait, I'm out because my Tiffany system doesn't have that sort of depth on the bench to engage that kind of threat.
Yeah, believe me, I know that magazine depth has long been a concern for the SWO community, and it's not just. You look at a Burke and it's got 92 cells. We don't have that many missiles in America. I mean, I don't think you could fill every VLS cell in the fleet. Or
I wouldn't know. That is. There is a programming office somewhere that has that number, and it is not one that I work in.
But it's always a concern. But one of the things about the distributed lethality that leaps out to me, and you were talking about Scan Eagle. I've been writing about Fire Scout a little bit, which.
So maybe you can explain this. And I complained about this in my proceedings article. It seems like a lot of our drones are just giant, normal-sized helicopters and aircraft. We took the people outside. Wasn't the whole point that they're like, oh man, there's no person in here, so I don't need life support, I don't need this, I don't need that. Okay, awesome, go.
Right.
Instead, we're like, just gut this Boeing aircraft and paint all the windows gray so people know there's no one inside. That doesn't. You're not really. There's a lot of competitive advantage here of having an unmanned system that you're completely ignoring.
Well, and you're talking about the MQ-8C, which is based on the Bell 407, which maybe did a little sleight of hand. Their first MQ-8 Fire Scout was based on a little tiny helicopter. The C model is based on an entirely different helicopter and somewhat bigger, but it's still called the MQ-8 because all the controls are the same. And I think the advantage you get there is a Bell 407, you're going to have a maximum endurance of about 3 hours. But the MQ-8C, just this week, they flew it for 11 hours, 150 miles away from Point Mugu, and came back, still had an hour's fuel in reserve. That's persistent ISR. So that's the advantage to that. And that's a platform that they can arm pretty quickly. You're not going to launch NSMs off of it, but you should be able to put some kind of guided rocket on it and have a pretty good over-the-horizon sensor.
You mentioned the NSM. One of the things that I really like is see these tests, and they're doing it out of sort of these braces, firing them off the flight decks and stuff like that. Like, why do I even need a VLS? Like, just send me out there with 100 of these. Send an LHA out. Don't even give it any aircraft. Just cover the entire flight deck with these things, and have half of them aiming over the port side, half of them aiming over the starboard side. And if something goes down, just press a huge red button and just let loose. You want to play the A2A? You want to play the A2AD game, son? Bring that shit. I mean, the ability to just put these things anywhere, kind of. I mean, they're all sort of madcap and silly. The idea of just turning everything into an arsenal ship, but it is kind of amusing to think all the crazy things that you could do. Cover the flight deck of an LCS with one, where they're all aiming to the rear, drive really hard at the enemy, and as soon as it looks like they know where you are, throw the wheel around and fire all the missiles as you run away. It's kind of nice to think that maybe the possibility exists one day that this A2AD equation, cuts both ways.
Yeah. What would you say though is the challenge? We were talking about command and control. The Army is a very dispersed force. They're used to having the captain out of the reach of the colonel, and the captain has to make decisions. And the Navy was very much like that for a long time, in that, you're the ship's captain, you're God, or at least at the right hand next to. But we're reading Commander Salamander and some of the other Navy blogs, it seems like that ethos has kind of gotten away to where now the captains are tied, held on a much shorter leash. But distributed operations, distributed lethality is going to call for more of a mission order mindset. Do you think the Navy's ready for that? Or do you think they're going to try and hold everybody on the short link of link 16?
Well, so there's sort of two parts to that. One, there is a difference between sort of our operational concept and ethos. I don't think the ethos has gone anywhere. I think people still believe in command as that sort of over-the-horizon message to Garcia concept. Yes, I know message to Garcia is not a Navy story, but you get my point.
I learned it from Rex. That makes it a Navy story to me.
There you go. By the way, that story is bullshit because he was sent over the horizon to do one thing. They said do one thing and go figure it out. And people say, oh, no, I'm doing 30 things right now. Thank you very much. And they're all message to Garcia. If somebody went and told Garcia and say, go rebuild a model city of Havana in the middle of the jungle, he'd say, screw you. I'm not doing all those thousands of things all by myself. But really great article by friend Jim Davenport called Distributed Lethality, a sort of cultural shift. And it talks a little bit about some of the concepts that are necessary in sort of embracing distributed lethality. And I think part of that is going to be that, I say there's a difference between ethos and operational concept. Well, distributed lethality is, to us, a new concept. I would say that to a certain point, no, we are not ready to execute on it because we have not practiced to it. Maybe the willingness is, the mind is willing, but the body is weak because, even if you've got a guy that's been doing nothing but cardio, that doesn't mean he can go bench 200 right off the bat. We have been doing something else. So it's a very subtle question to say, is this something we're ready for? And we will be, and we could do a version of this, I believe, but it's the same as saying, is the United States Navy ready for, carrier-to-carrier warfighting, a few years after we put out the Langley? No. That you're not going to, because you're going to a different concept, something you haven't practiced to, something that's new. Now, for distributed lethality, it's not necessarily new. This has been sort of a concept that has existed throughout the history of naval warfare. But these are new weapon systems, new capabilities, new environments, new threats. It's something that we have to stretch. It's a muscle that we need to exercise to make it have an impact. So I'd say that I plead the fifth on the answer to this question.
All right, Jason, you got anything for him?
Well, something I've always wanted to ask was, you've done a lot of work with innovation and that kind of thing. And I guess it's kind of a bit of a depth question, but how do you go from, okay, this idea is really freaking awesome, you get a lot of opposition, and then you go to how do you just figure out an idea is not going to work and let go? Something so whiz bang, you can't let it go, and how do you decide? Or it's a horrible question.
No. I see exactly. Your question is a good one. I have not had enough chips to bet to learn that kind of lesson yet. The stuff that I've done is, to a certain degree, easy. Now, all the work that folks do at SimSec isn't necessarily easy, but no one's going to come up to me and say, "Hey, stop running your website." I mean, that could have happened. Someone could have come out of the woodwork and said, "We don't like what you guys are doing." To a certain point, I've been lucky, and part of that being lucky, has been sort of self-selecting. You go out, you run with a certain circle of folks that like writing, that enjoy sort of engaging in this back and forth and this debate on policy and defense. And you'll find people who will be champions for people that that will appreciate your writing, that will advertise it, that will defend it. Not necessarily the content of your writing, but the project itself. And I have sort of started all of this in a particularly rich environment that was set for me by a number of people beforehand. So a lot of the work that we were able to do was easy to execute. Not easy in and of itself, but the barriers were knocked down by others. And there was a lot of buy-in. So to a certain point, the lesson that you're looking for a reflection on, I have not learned yet. Now, in some areas, I think it just, why not? Just keep going for it. If it doesn't seem like it makes sense, and there was something that you missed, or there was another way to do it, as long as it's not messing with your family or ruining your ability to do your job, and it's something that you like, why not? It's if you keep failing, but it's something you're passionate about, you learn every time. So, we're coming up with this. Sorry. We're doing this innovation competition on October 2nd, funded by SNA, SimSec, and USI down here in Norfolk. And, for example, the SimSec chapter down here in Norfolk, it's kind of failed multiple times just because everybody is so busy. And folks have done a really good job trying to start events and have people come back, but it always ends up getting that folks have work, they don't have time, they live down in Chesapeake, and you're doing it over in Virginia Beach, or whatever the case is. And, something always gets in the way, and we keep plugging away. Now we're doing this event. It's going to be a lot of fun down at Work Release. If you look it up on Facebook, Athena East Innovation Competition. You can see some of the details in the registration page and the posters we have for it. But I feel like, so I don't want to jinx myself, I feel like this is going to be a success. But a lot of this wouldn't be possible if you hadn't failed a bunch of times. So if failing's, to a certain point, if failing's no skin off your back, and you're not sort of screwing with your friends or the people that you love, you have a lot of bandwidth in your life. Why not use it for something you're passionate about and you might not succeed on? Because you're not always going to succeed, so just, go with it.
Okay, and I kind of want to build on that. Look back at the beginning of blogging, 2004, 2003, 2004. Lex, Commander Salamander.
Who was featured on the Naval Heritage and History Command Facebook page.
I saw that.
It was excellent.
And his portrait looks just like him.
Yes.
Here's the interesting thing. They blogged under a pseudonym.
Right.
And that was, I can't think of a Navy blog dating back to them that wasn't under a pseudonym. Back then, if you wanted to write, you wrote for proceedings or you didn't. It was just the way it was. And now here, here's Matt Hipple, doesn't just write, he's the president of his own, well, not his own, but of a respected organization, and
It's a banana republic. It does belong
yeah,
to me.
okay, and
Once I'm elected, it's sort of like, until the next election, I get to do whatever I want.
one man, one vote, one election. Uh,
Just enough rope, depending on how you look at it, too.
Yeah, exactly.
but and since that's not the only one, Jason mentioned DEF, the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. These things are.
There's also the Bridge. They do a lot of good work.
Mhm.
Small Work Journal. There's even the blog. There's a blog at USNI now.
Yep.
So I think I know where you're going with this question, and it. So to a certain point. Okay, so I was a wee lad who still played Power Pete on his Gateway computer at home back when these guys started blogging. So to a certain, I think it was just something new in general. So the trepidation I could see is natural, and it was intelligence as well, because I'm sure there was a lot of people that didn't understand. They're like, what are you doing sort of talking outside of class? This is not something that we do, because there were a lot more gatekeepers. I think to a certain point, the work that they did and the changing environment in the media has meant that not only are there more people that sort of embrace it, but there's also more understanding of it. There may be some question where someone's like, well, you read all this nonsense on PolitiFact, for example, and they're like, oh, look, the Navy's stupid, like, Navy's big enough, blah, 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 and then saying something dumbass about the Washington Naval Treaty. I think that becomes mocked or something, claiming that's why our Navy was small today. Just insanely incompetent things. And people look at that and say, well, why do I want to get involved in that? And to a certain point, I get that instinct. And you say, like, why? Like,
Uh-oh. Matthew, are you with us? Jason?
like, then begin to sort
I'm
of...
here.
Okay. Matthew? You're cutting out, Matthew. I think we're going to have to wrap this up.
Wait, you can't... Give me a second. I've got a plug. Give me 1 second here.
First, he's gonna plug SimSec. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect, awesome. Sorry, I wandered outside. I'm on a wireless headset. Where did you lose me? I'll just start from there.
About 1 minute ago.
Okay. Was I saying? What was I saying? Do you?
We were talking about it's more accepted now. There's more gatekeepers.
It's more accepted. Sort of a lot of the gatekeepers are falling away, and there's a lot of folks that maybe look at this and say, well, okay, there's so much incompetence out there. Why do you want to get involved? You look at like PolitiFact and Vox, and there's a whole bunch of people who don't know what the hell they're talking about. Quote unquote, fact checking things. I'm a fact checker. What the hell does that mean? Are you a historian? Are you a scientist? Do you study naval architecture? Do you understand the readiness side? No, you don't know anything. You just put fact checker in front of your name and go on Wikipedia, go crawl into a hole. And these people are out there, and they do make it look really stupid. And you say, why do I want to get involved in this? Well, the problem is that when there are a lot of really loud, stupid people throwing out little buzz and narratives and catchphrases that people are catching on to, if they're the only show in town, you end up getting screwed because you're the one who cares. There's a lot of people with skin in the game, and if they're not the ones who are out there and saying, hey, time out, maybe your article gets 10,000 people reading it, and maybe mine's going to get 300. But there's going to be 300 more people now that, because of your dumb article, now understand a concept like the readiness cycle, or what magazine depth, why that's important, or quality and versus quantity, capacity versus capability, and as stupidity is a hard wave to stop, but it's better for there to be some kind of resistance than none at all. And so I think that when these guys started out, they had the right instinct, they embraced the new technology, and that the pseudonym was necessary because people didn't know how to react. and they would have naturally reacted poorly to these guys being out here in this new medium that they didn't necessarily understand. But because of what they did and the broader societal acceptances of medium and the way the Navy now uses a lot of the social media, it's become more acceptable, and a lot of us are allowed to stand humbly on the shoulders of giants here. So,
who was it? Harvey? Admiral Harvey had a blog?
Admiral Harvey, I think, just went on Sailor Bob, and people would talk shit about him, and he'd say, well, that's an interesting point, because I'm right here, and I'd like to have a little chat about, that kind of stuff. So it's fun when someone's on, they have a presence, and they're smart enough to be out there and engage these points. Because if you're going to say something about, fleet forces or a MICPON or a personnel or a CNO policy, and all of a sudden on your comment you see, from, NAVPER's actual going like, step back, son, because here's, not in that tone, of course. A lot of these folks embrace this as an opportunity to educate. But there's, when people realize that folks are paying attention, and those folks who are paying attention know how to engage in the space, it's very powerful. And it sets a good example for others as well, because, for every, 2, 3, 4-star admiral that's engaging people, one would hope that there's an army of, second class or lieutenants or O4s that are out there listening to people saying dumb shit, and in a constructive way, hopefully. I imagine often not, because it is really frustrating, sort of correcting the record. It's never going to be perfect, and you're never going to get over the folks like the James, what was his, Fowler, Foley? What's that guy, the draft dodger over the Atlantic?
Oh, yeah, Foley.
The one anthropologist in the New York Times who wanted to talk about how bad bases were because he clearly didn't understand why they exist. They're going to always get a huge platform. They're going to have access to the media elite. And if you want somebody to combat that, if you're wondering who it is, the reason you're wondering is because you are that guy.
All right. Well, you know what? I think it is great that everybody has a voice. That's about our time for today. I think we did a little better than we expected. We managed to talk about Chinese maritime strategy. We did get a good in-depth discussion of into distributed lethality, and we even explored military social media for a bit. Any last quick hits, Jason?
Not really, unless Matt, there's anything that you want to plug. I'm going to take that that blogging or that podcast thing from you. So if there's anything you want to plug, I guess now's a good time.
Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, I'd like to plug you guys and apologize to your entire audience for having to listen to me babble for an hour. If you're listening this far, there's got to be something wrong with you. I would have clicked off in about 30 minutes. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But I do want to plug the Sea Control podcast. I do have the opportunity to bring on folks who are much more intelligent and informed than I am and ask them the questions that hopefully you and I are both thinking. I think, when does this post? Okay, if you're listening to this on a Friday, stand by for the Sea Control on Monday. If you're listening to this on Monday, today, go download Sea Control, because we're going to have Paul Shar, Adam Elkis, and Mike Horowitz on to talk about sort of the nature of autonomy and some policy and technology questions that'll be really interesting. And, of course, plugging SimSec, because it is the greatest of all the things, and the Pritzker Military Library podcast, because that is also astounding and incredible. And if you like Sea Control, the Pritzker Military Library podcast is like 1,000 times better than that.
That's Sea Control podcast is at simsec.org, CIMSEC.org. And
just look it up on iTunes.
And it's the Pritzker Military Museum and Library now. So,
well,
definitely.
Hey. Ohio State University, okay.
Oh, don't look at me. It's Jason's gig. All right. Thanks a lot, Matt. Wonderful having you on behalf of Jason and myself, XPAD. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we'll be hopefully doing this again next week.